Okay, welcome everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. I'll probably be joined by a few more people as we come along. We've already got a great crowd here. Welcome, my name is Bill Cavanaugh. I am the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. And we would love to be together with you in person, and we had planned on that and hoped for it. And the coronavirus had other ideas. We thought the numbers were just too high, but we are hoping that as the winter and spring quarters move along and the numbers improve, God willing, that we'll be able to do some more events in person as the outlook looks up. But being online has a few advantages, one of which is that we are able to be joined by people from around the world. And we have people registered from many other places, including Poland. So, and I think it's 3 in the morning there now. So some insomniacs from Poland will be joining us tonight. We have a speaker series. This is the first of our series over the winter and spring quarters on immigrant and migrant Catholicism in the United States. Our center is usually about Catholicism around the world in other places. And this series is about the Catholicism of the world in the United States, coming through the immigrant experience. And so we have events coming up on Vietnamese Catholics in the US, Mexican Catholics, Filipino Catholics, Black Catholics migrating from the north, from the south to the north. And today we get the series rolling with Polish Catholics in the United States and especially in Chicago. And for that, I'm very pleased to introduce Dominic Pacyga, who is Professor Emeritus at Columbia College in Chicago and is known as perhaps the dean of historians of the Polish diaspora around the world, and especially in Chicago. He is the author of 7 books, most recently American Warsaw, which like many of his other books has won awards. He has taught at Oxford and at the University in Krakow, and been involved with many different projects. I first saw him in the documentary, The Fourth Partition, about Polish immigration to Chicago. It's a brilliant film if you get a chance to see it. And Dominic stands out for the way that he's able to bring history alive and tell great stories. So like any great historian, he doesn't just know his stuff, but he's able to get people excited about it as well. So without any further ado, please please join me in welcoming Dominic Pacyga.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for that introduction. Let me try to share my screen here and get this going. So American Warsaw, Polish Catholic immigrants in Chicago. What I want to do in this lecture is really look at Polish Catholicism beyond the church walls and more as a culture as well as a religion. To understand the Polish American Catholic experience, I think one has to understand both Polish history and immigrant history. The problem of Poland. Poland was a large country. It was once the largest country in Europe until the end of the 18th century, when it was partitioned by its 3 neighbors, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Prussia, which later became Germany. That partition lasted for 123 years, and Poland basically disappeared from the map of Europe. But this state that had existed was a very diverse, multi-ethnic state. It included not only Poles, but Czechs, Jews. It was the largest Jewish country in the world at one point. It included Czechs and Slovaks, White Russians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, even Assyrians, who built a really multi-ethnic state all under the Polish crown. And this has a lot of implications for the diaspora as well, because who is a Pole becomes very much a question over time. So these Polish lands, while they were divided by their three neighbors, came back together after World War I and created a new Poland. It held its independence for 20 years and then was invaded by the Nazis and by the Russians. The Nazis attacked on September 1st, 1939. The Soviet Union attacked on September 17th, 1939, and Poland went through another transformation. After the war, it was established as a more smaller state. It was more ethnically Polish, and it was under communist rule for until 1989, 1990 or so. So this is the sort of history, the overall history of the country. And I want to talk about how it impacts not only the diaspora, but the Polish church. One of the questions that comes up in the diaspora as well as in Poland itself is, who's a Pole? What about these minorities, Polish Jews and other minorities? Are they Polish just because they were once, under the Polish crown? As nationalism grew in the 19th century, these ethnicities began to divide amongst themselves and in some ways began to see themselves as not only as neighbors, but sometimes as adversaries. I'm going to, of course, focus on Polish Catholics in this lecture, and especially on the three great migrations, the first of which was the za chlebem, which means for bread. That's the peasant economic migration from about 1850 to 1925. This is the real planting of seed, the planting of the seed of the Polish community in Chicago. It is the largest migration. It is the migration that creates this institutional base that emerges. Poles came after the Irish, after the Germans. Steamship travel had made crossing the Atlantic pretty easy, pretty safe. It was about 10 days, a week to 10 days from Hamburg or from Bremen to New York. Once you were in New York, of course, they disembarked at Ellis Island after 1892. Ellis Island was the immigrant station from 1892 to 1954, where they went through the process of coming into the country, and then, of course, had to make their way to Chicago. This is a typical immigrant paper from about the turn of the century. This is a fellow named Frank Nyemchik. Frank is seen here as being 53 years of age. He was 5'5.5" tall. Supposedly had a low forehead, though it looks a little high to me at this point. Anyway, the story of Nyemchik is kind of important because he grew up in the German-occupied part of Poland in what we call Pruski Polski, or the German-occupied partition. And so he spoke German. He had served in the German army. When he came to Chicago, he got a job in the stockyards that he didn't really like. He wanted to work with the horses, and because the horses were used to deliver meat, etc. But that was completely controlled by Germans. They wouldn't allow Poles into that department. So he changed his name to, Frederick Lyman. Since he spoke German fluently, he passed as a German. And when he crossed 47th Street, he passed as a Pole. So that says a lot about what ethnicity is. Ethnicity is sometimes a choice, what people make a choice of what they want to be over time. Anyway, once you come into the country and once you make your way, of course, you're making your way from New York on trains. Another interesting story about this is when the trains would come in through Pennsylvania, from New York through Pennsylvania into Ohio. Remember that Chicago was the center and still is the center of the railroad industry. So you had all kinds of trains coming into the city. Immigrant trains are third-class trains. Second-class trains are livestock trains. So if there's a big run at the Union Stockyards, if you're getting 30,000 cattle or 80,000 hogs or 70,000 sheep, you could be on an immigrant train coming into Chicago and be held up in Ohio overnight while all the cattle and livestock trains came into the city. So if your cousin's waiting for you at the train station downtown, your train doesn't show, he's got to go to work the next day, he goes home. So how do you do this? Suddenly you get downtown and you're in this mess, right? There's a wonderful Jewish word, Mishigas. It means quite a mess, it's a Mishigas. Well, look at this Mishigas. This is not State Street. This is not Michigan Avenue. This is Dearborn and Randolph in 1900. All of these lines are coming together. By the way, in this picture, there's not an automobile in this picture. They are all cable cars, streetcars, or horses and wagons. And this is one of the more famous pictures that appears in every urban history book. Unfortunately, it's also a phony photograph. The photographer tipped the police to cause a traffic jam, so he could prove that Chicago was busier than New York. And the sort of New York-Chicago competition roared on. Getting from downtown, you had to get on a streetcar and find your way someplace. Now, by the way, when the trains would come in, they'd come in across Indiana, and the first thing they hear is, the conductor yelling, "East Chicago, Indiana." Well, you don't speak English. You hear the word Chicago, you get off the train, you're in Indiana. You're supposed to be on Milwaukee Avenue in Chicago. Now you're in East Chicago, Indiana. Sometimes you'd stay on, they call South Chicago. You get off at South Chicago, but your cousin lives in, the Westtown neighborhood up on Milwaukee Division and Ashland. And now you're on 87th and Commercial Avenue. Where do you go? How do you get back? So Polish organizations began to plant people at these train stations, said, "Do you really want to go to East Chicago, Indiana, or do you really want to go into the city?" and talk to them in Polish and tell them to get back on the train, to try to help people to go through this migration process. Anyway, once you came into Chicago, if you can see here, my pointer here's the downtown. The first settlement was to the northwest of the downtown, the St. Stanislaus Koska Parish, Holy Family later, and St. John Cantius. The second was at St. Adalbert's on the lower west side. That's Pilsen, the Pilsen area. And then came Bridgeport, back of the yards, and in the inset here, South Chicago. These were the first 5 neighborhoods to greet immigrants from Poland into the area. The basic way of life was to find a job. Here are workers outside of the Armour and Company meatpacking plant in Chicago. Those doors would open up, the straw bosses would come out. Straw bosses were generally not Polish, they tended to be Irish or German. And they'd point and say, I need somebody to work on a slaughterhouse. Let's go, you. You get a brass tag, you hand it in at the end of the day, you get paid, you're back outside the next morning looking for a job again. Unless he liked you, unless you tipped him the proper way, which was usually $1. If you tipped him $1, you got put on the regular payroll. You had to learn these things as you came in through the immigration. Chicago's always been kind of a little corrupt town in every way that it goes. Anyway, so most of these people were coming to look for unskilled positions in mass production industries, such as the stockyards, the steel mills, or the tanneries on the north branch of the Chicago River. They worked in factories, they worked in slaughterhouses, etc. The days would run, they were usually 12 to 16-hour days at the turn of the century. So this was really hardcore industrial work. They lived in working class neighborhoods like the back of the yards, or what we now call, interestingly enough, we now call it Wicker Park, but it was always known as Westtown or Polish Downtown, or in Polish, Stanisławowo, this immigrant community at a Milwaukee Division in Ashland. These were places that were often not tied into the major sewer lines, waterworks, things like that. So they lived in slum conditions. In many ways. I was once asked, I was giving a tour of one of these neighborhoods, and somebody says, "Well, how could we restore this neighborhood to its original, look?" And I said, "Well, all you have to do is turn it into a Victorian slum, and you've got a great neighborhood." I mean, it's better today than it was then. Family was at the core, the basis for a sense of community. Holding on to each other, and always also holding on to one's culture. And Poles in particular, but other Catholic immigrant groups as well, look to the church to continue this tradition. Polish church tradition was an old one. Poland has been Christian for over 1,000 years. This is the Mariacki in Kraków in the south of Poland. This is probably the most famous church in Poland. The idea that the church would somehow protect Polskość, Polishness, was very important in Poland. Remember, Poland's occupied. Russians, Germans, Austro-Hungarians occupy Poland. They're trying to get people to speak German and Russian. In Russia and in Germany, the church is always under strain. Bismarck's Kulturkampf is trying to basically destroy Catholicism, especially Polish Catholicism. And the Russians are trying to convert people to the Russian Orthodox Church. The Austrians are Catholic, so the Catholic Church thrives in the Austrian partition. And the Austrian partition actually is where Polskość thrives the most, also the sense of Polishness, because the church protected it. How do you take this now into the diaspora? How do you take it into the immigrant, into the immigrant community? This Polish church tradition created parishes in places like Chicago. The first one was Stephens Koska. The neighborhood, we called it Stanisławowo. The photograph up here at the top is a man named Piotr Kielbasa. He was one of the founders of the parish. And these are the important clergy that really made St. Stanisław Koska grow. These are the Barszynski brothers, especially Father Vincent Barszynski, who was the pastor of the community. This is their father. This is a very important Catholic newspaper writer, his other brother, and then another brother who was also a Catholic priest. Vincent Barszynski was a member of the Resurrectionist order. And this became very important. Remember, in Poland, Poles saw their country as the Christ of nations, crucified on a cross of Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia. And so they saw this as in a sort of revolutionary kind of way, that Poland was this symbol. It was the Christ of the nations, crucified by its neighbors who had betrayed it. And the resurrectionists were, ostensibly named after the resurrection of Christ, right? But it also stood for the resurrection of Poland. So they were a very nationalist order as well, that Poland would somehow rise above this again and return itself. So St. Stanisław Koska, which is a parish which is still there. By the way, it's the only parish, I think, in the Archdiocese that's open 24 hours a day still. They actually have a guard there all night, and they have worship all night at St. Stan's. They have a mass in Polish, Spanish, and in English. In a neighborhood that is becoming more and more gentrified, much more upper middle class than it ever was before. These parishes were built, and by the end, there are some 60 Chicago Polish parishes in the city and in the suburbs. These parishes were built on the nickels and dimes of these poor, unskilled workers. Here we have St. Mary of Perpetual Help in Bridgeport, St. John Cantius in Westtown or Wicker Park, and up here, of course, Sacred Heart in Back of the Arts. That, by the way, was my parish. I grew up in Sacred Heart. That's the black and white photo at the top. These parishes meant community. Okay, so parish for Polonia, and that's the name we give to the diaspora, Polonia. Parish meant community. It meant a preservation of Polskość or Polishness. And these immigrants strove to create a community that would take care of their people from cradle to grave. And of course, as Catholics, we take care of people after grave, right? Because we pray for the souls in purgatory to go straight to heaven, right? So this whole idea was this was going to be an enclosed community that would take care of its culture and take care of its people, while still being loyal to the American Republic, right? Still being Americans, but they would continue to keep their culture, as most immigrant groups try to do. This was a communal response, building a sense of community. This went beyond regionalism in Poland. So it didn't matter what region of Poland you were a part of. When you came into the parish, you were Polish. It was protection in an often hostile environment. Capitals, remember, these are rural folk who scratched out a living on very poor farms, very small farms, very poor farms in Poland. They're now thrown into this industrial nexus, this an industrial system that is they don't quite understand. They're thrown in with all kinds of different people. They're standing next to Germans and Irish and African Americans and Jews and Germans and Italians. And they don't speak each other's languages. They're all being exploited at the same time. The question becomes, how do you get power to impact your own society? How do you obtain political and economic power in an industrial democracy? And the first step was to build a community, to build walls around the community, to protect it, to give it a chance to grow. Crucial to this was the parochial school system. Every one of the Polish parishes in Chicago had a parochial school, and several had parochial high schools. The parochial school in the very beginning was taught all day in Polish. The Archdiocese put a stop to that rather quickly. So it was half day in Polish, half day in English. The important courses were taught in Polish, right? Religion, history, those kinds of courses, the humanities. The unimportant ones were taught in English, right? That would be American history. That would be math. That would be so forth. So kids grew up being bilingual. In some cases, kids born in the United States actually spoke Polish better than their parents did, who were born in Poland, because their parents only had a third or fourth or fifth grade education, where here you had 8 years of Polish language. And if you went to a Polish American high school, you got another 4 years. So you were, pretty good in the language. This system broke down, especially after World War II. But it was very, very important that the idea of creating this sense of Polskość, of Polishness in Chicago. Nuns played a very, very crucial role in this. Polish Catholic orders came from Poland to teach in these schools. This is a Felician sister, one of the largest orders to come to Chicago. And this is a Polish Catholic. This is the Sacred Heart Catholic school in back of the yards here. Polish businesses thrived along the main avenues. Some of these Polish businesses were Polish Jews, some were Polish Christians, but they was part of a community that these peasants understood, because in Poland they had bartered, they had worked with Polish Jews had worked with them in a very complex economic order. But there was, of course, competition between Polish Christians and Polish Jews, which sometimes led to anti-Semitism in these neighborhoods. Crucial to every neighborhood was the ethnic saloon. In Polonia, the saloon wasn't simply a place you went to get drunk. It was a place you met your neighbor. It was a place you got information. It was a place that you organized labor unions in the back room of. You organized actually Catholic parishes in the back room of saloons. The priest was a often visitor to the saloon to talk with his parishioners. The saloon was not only a men's club, it was a family place. Kids ran in and out. Women were welcome in Polish saloons, as they had been in Poland. And that's not to say that alcohol wasn't a problem in Polonia. It certainly was. Alcohol abuse was certainly a problem. But I think sometimes the saloon was painted in a way that was seen by American reformers and also by Catholic reformers who were pushing the idea of staying away from alcohol, of prohibition, as an evil, dark, evil place of sin. In most cases in these neighborhoods, that was not true. They were places where people met and talked and discussed problems. Remember, you're talking about in neighborhoods that had very little places for public space. There weren't a lot of halls. There weren't a lot of places where people could gather and talk. There weren't a lot of parks at the very beginning either. So the saloon provided a place to create a public sphere. A public sphere is a place, is something where people can discuss their problems and try to deal with them in various kinds of ways. Out of this came also the largest fraternals. Now, this is something to think about when you think about Polish Catholicism. The two largest fraternals were the Polish Roman Catholic Union, which is the oldest, and the Polish National Alliance. For the Polish Roman Catholic Union to become a member, you had to be Catholic. Well, this eliminated a large part of the old Polish Commonwealth's population, who were Orthodox, who were Jews, some were Protestants, and there were atheists, of course, right, as in any society. But you had to vow that you were a Catholic to join the Polish Roman Catholic Union. For the Polish National Alliance, all you had to do was say Poland was the place you wanted resurrected. You could be a Jew, you could be a Catholic, you could be a Protestant, you could be an atheist, you could be a socialist. There were plenty of socialists who joined the PNA. If all you thought about really was the independence of Poland. So this was a more nationalist organization. These two organizations fought across Polish society in America. St. Stanislaus Koska Church was the oldest church. A church 3 blocks down the street from it on Noble Street was created, called Holy Trinity. Holy Trinity was a nationalist church. St. Stanislaus Koska was a less nationalist church. They were both Catholic. They argued over Poland and they split. And in the long run, this also created the largest schism in American history, the Polish National Catholic Church, which was the largest schism in American Catholic history and still schismatic as of today. But Holy Trinity remained in, the parishioners refused to accept the resurrectionist order at Holy Trinity. And they were finally, the Holy Cross Fathers came and settled in Holy Trinity and allowed it to grow as a PNA, basically as a Polish National Alliance parish. So it was really kind of interesting because to modern ears, this ideology, doesn't sound real. You're both Catholic, you both believe in the same things religiously. But what's this idea about what's Poland? Who's Poland? Well, why is that such a big question? But it rips the community apart for probably 50 years until World War I. Taking care of their own, taking care of their own, food baskets for the poor, and guardian angel. The guardian angel, which is the building down at the bottom of the slide, was put together by 3 Polish parishes in back of the yard: Sacred Heart, St. Joseph, and St. John of God. It was created as a home for working women. Single women would come from Poland in the immigration, and some of them did not know anybody here. They had no place to live. They were worried about, falling into prostitution or into other vice businesses. So the nuns and the priests of those parishes established a Holy Cross Home for Working Women and Child Daycare Center. It was a completely female organized institution. It was a female settlement house, basically a Catholic settlement house. And it was just 2 doors away from the University of Chicago settlement house, which everybody saw as the Protestant settlement house. And so here you had this institution run by nuns, run by women, for women and for children, which lasted well into the 1970s. The upper picture is getting together a bunch of food baskets for the poor on the northwest side of the Polish community. The whole idea here was that this community would take care of its own. They would somehow protect its own and keep its own in this sense of Polishness. Even the creation of St. Mary of Nazareth Hospital off of Division Street, which is seen here, the original hospital on the upper left, and the newer hospital under construction. And of course, cemeteries, right? These cemeteries, Resurrection, this is St. Adalbert Cemetery in Niles, Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, and Mary Hill Cemetery also in Niles, were 3 major Polish cemeteries. By the way, if you're ever on the South Side, if you ever, lose a fear of going south of Roosevelt Road, and you come out to Justice, this mausoleum is actually a sort of museum of Polish and Polish American history. It's an exquisite building. It has the largest stained glass windows in the world. It's in Justice, just off of Archer Avenue. The cemetery is better known for the Resurrection Mary ghost story, but the mausoleum is really worth taking a look at. It's actually a museum of Polish and Polish American history. World War I becomes the crucial event. It is the big change. Poland wins its independence in 1918. During the war, Chicago and Chicago parishes stand up together and raise millions of dollars for Polish war relief for those who are suffering from the war being fought across Poland. Poland was the equivalent of the Western Front, but in the East. Poland was devastated by World War I. This is, by the way, the famous pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski and Jan Smolski, who was his right-hand man in Chicago, collecting money to help the Polish victims with war relief. Polish Chicago, along with the rest of the American Polonia, also organized an army of some 25,000 men who fought on the Western Front and fought in Poland later on against the Soviets to secure Poland's independence. But the 1920s were a period of assimilation. Here we see Martha Washington and other grand dames appear in Pulaski Park. If you look at Martha Washington's name, her real name is Alice Moniuszko, Stella Chropliwe, and Mary Moniuszko. They're Polish kids. They're learning to become American. Assimilation is taking place in the 1920s. This ends up with it's called an extra-communal response. That is Polonia, Polish diaspora, reaching beyond its ethnic borders, beyond those walls that it erected during the period of communalism, to reach out to other ethnic groups based on social class, common interests, convenience, necessity, to create something we call countervailing power. That's the ability to push back. This meant labor unions, cooperatives, political machines, neighborhood organizations. And the Catholic Church, by the way, was active in all 4 of these organizations. Father Grudzinski supported United Packing House, supported Amalgamated Meat Cutters and later United Packing House workers. Polish priests in South Chicago supported the United Steelworkers. They used their influence to get men and women to join those unions. And of course, the idea of cooperatives was sort of an inward-looking kind of experience also, to try to create businesses that would serve that community, and political machines, of course, and neighborhood organizations like the Russell Square Community Committee in South Chicago. Part of this came together under a non-Pole, Anton Cermak, or Cermak, a Bohemian, a Czech, who created the modern Democratic Party in Chicago. But a big important part of his coalition, this ethnic coalition in the Democratic Party, was the Polish American Democratic Organization, or PADO. The Poles began to rise in power. By 1930, there's about 350,000 Poles living in the city of Chicago. So they have real, in the local parlance, clout, right? They have real political power. And Cermak understands that, and he brings them into his coalition. And those who replaced Cermak after Cermak's assassinated in 1933 keep the Poles in that coalition. The Union movement, the Catholic Church supports, there's a whole group of young priests in the 1930s, many of them Poles and other ethnic groups, who began to support the labor movement very, very seriously. These were called the young priests, or the rebel priests, or the working class priests. They followed some of the action that was taking place in France, and it would later show itself here with the Catholic workers movement. So many of them were seen as quite radical, and they helped to organize labor unions that actually, as we can see from this slide, were multiracial as well as multi-ethnic, because Black Americans were moving to northern cities in larger and larger numbers after 1915. And so they became an important component of the workforce. They worked with Poles in these labor movements. Finally, World War II. World War II comes in. Poland is the first to fight against the Nazis. Of course, it was brutally attacked and occupied from 1939 till 1945. In Chicago, that means World War II, it means mass mobilization. Young men like this, originally an American cavalry officer who went off to war and later ended up in an armor division. And these women who worked in the canning department at Armour and Company were part of the war effort. You've heard of Rosie the Riveter, those kinds of people. These were real Rosies. You know, students of mine often say, oh, women didn't go to work until 1943, but that's not true. Immigrant women, women of color, have always worked. In 1920, 1/5 of the workforce in the meatpacking houses in Chicago were female. Women didn't work in steel until after 1940 because there was fewer men to work in steel because they went in the army. Then they began to work in steel, but in much of the other mass production industries, you had women working on factory floors. The war resulted in a tremendous amount of displaced persons. There were several million Poles that were displaced in Eastern Europe. They were taken into as slave labor into Nazi Germany. They were taken into POW camps in Nazi Germany. Many of them were at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was originally a POW camp, and it was later turned into an extermination camp. Many Poles died along with Jews in those extermination camps. World War II, 6 million Polish citizens died in World War II. 6 million of them died, 3 million Polish Christians, 3 million Polish Jews. So there's a tremendous amount of displaced persons after the war. The Catholic Church and Polonia as well responded by opening up their doors, trying to bring these displaced persons and settle them into Chicago, get them jobs, settle them with families. And here we see members of the Polish National Alliance greeting a trainload of Polish displaced persons in 1940-48. Poland, after the war, becomes part of the Soviet camp because it's occupied by Russian soldiers. It becomes a communist country. And Poland is cut off from Polonia for a good long time, but eventually cultural traditions reestablish themselves, and there's a flow of ideas between the two. In Chicago, of course, polka. Polka becomes the sort of music of Polonia, right? And I don't know if any of you have been to a polka picnic, but it can be quite rowdy. Anyway, so these are some of the banners, some of the placards for Polish picnics in Chicago, which also, once again, created a sense of community and created this idea of Polskość. Deindustrialization hits the American working class. It hits the Polish American working class very hard. Steel, meatpacking, Western Electric and Cicero, all those tanneries along the Chicago River on the north side, all those other factories, they begin to disappear in the years after World War II. This is an old meatpacking plant that probably at one time had something like 1,000 people working in it. You can see it here just sort of sitting empty and abandoned. Expressway construction comes in and rips through neighborhoods. St. Stanislaus Koska Parish, which was the largest Polish parish in the city of Chicago. When the Northwest Expressway came through, that's today what we call the Kennedy, it removed 400 families out of St. Stanislaus Koska. 400 families were removed. So of course the parish was shocked, right? Economic turmoil. 400 families had been just taken off for highway construction. This happened across the city. It is estimated at over 8,000 families, so that'd be about 40,000 people were removed from the city for highway construction so that people could get to places like Naperville and Schaumburg a little faster, right? You can't imagine getting to Naperville or Schaumburg on the streets. It would take you forever if you were working downtown. But the expressways made that more possible, the expansion across the prairie. In Poland, anti-communist feelings erupted in 1956, 1968, 1971, and then finally the Solidarity, which exploded in the early 1980s and eventually brought down the communist government in Poland. This was an ongoing struggle. Chicago Polonia was very, very active in trying to help Solidarity, raising money through its parish system and through its fraternal organizations to try to help send medicine and food and money to the union movement and labor movement in Poland. But this also resulted then in this will result, of course, also now in another migration, right? So a newer migration of people who will come because of Solidarity, because of how the Polish economy was upset, and also because of political reasons. People were fleeing from Poland, coming back into Chicago and reviving inner city communities in many ways. I should point out that this was both a political and an economic immigration in the 1990s. And there was also a group called vacationers, wakacjusze. These were people who supposedly came on vacation visas to visit, to look at things. And they would disappear into the economy because if you were Polish and you could easily disappear into the sort of under the table economy in Chicago, get a job as a bartender, a construction worker, or truck driver, get paid under the table and sort of stay forever. I had a friend who actually was working on my house, and I asked him one day how long he'd been on vacation. And he said, I've been on vacation 26 years. So illegal immigration. In 1990, the largest legal immigrant group in Chicago were the Poles. The second largest legal immigrant group were the Mexicans. In 1990, the largest illegal group in Chicago were the Mexicans. the second largest illegal group in Chicago were the Poles. And so you get both of these groups trying to just, edge out a better life for themselves. And of course, there were all these institutions in both communities that could protect them within those, sort of immigrant ghetto walls. Polonia today is very large. It is spread across the cityscape. The sign is during the Polish Constitution Day parade, May 3rd parade. The sign says, Dwie ojczyzny, jedno serce. It means two fatherlands, two homelands, one heart, that they are loyal to both the United States and to Poland. There's a constant showing of Polonia, of Polish Catholicism, of Polish pride. Here we see various showings of that. Sox Park, Polish Heritage Night, St. John Paul II altar in the Polish Parish on the south side, and the Polish parade. Immigration has been cut off largely. Once Poland joined the European Union and once Poland became part of NATO, it became easier for Poles to get jobs in Western Europe. I was talking to some people earlier tonight. I mentioned that when I was in Sicily, someone told me there were 50,000 Poles working in Sicily. Construction jobs all over Italy are manned by Poles. There are 13 buses a day from Poznan to Brussels, Belgium. So it's easier to go to get a job in Brussels or France or Germany and come home, right? For Easter, come home for Christmas. Doesn't cost you several $1,000s to fly over the Atlantic. And you don't need a passport. You're part of the EU. You can just pass through all these countries without any need for a visa, etc. Today's Polonia is largely suburban. About 90% of all Polish Americans live in the suburbs like Niles, or on the southwest side, Justice. This, by the way, is the Polish mayor of Justice, Chris Vaslowicz. What this meant is this sort of disbursement in the suburbs, however, has meant that Polonia has lost clout. That clout that it had in the Democratic Party is basically gone, because it's now replaced. The 300,000 Poles, right, are now replaced by 300,000 Mexicans, right? So who's going to get those jobs and who's going to get those political positions? Well, Mexicans, because they have the clout, right? Poles are scattered through various suburbs. They don't have the political clout they once had. And Polish churches have been closing sort of left and right in Chicago. But nevertheless, there is an ongoing connection. This is the Tygodnik Podhalański. It's a newspaper from the part of Poland my family's from, the Polish mountains, Podhala. When I'm in Podhala, I always pick up a copy of the Tygodnik. Tygodnik is the weekly Podhalan. And in the back are advertisements for insurance companies, lawyers, delicatessens, and construction firms in Chicago. They take these advertisements out because the connection between Poland and Chicago is ongoing, though it is much smaller today than it once was. There's an ongoing cultural connection in Grant Park and across the cityscape, and is maintaining this ethnic cultural connection. This is the Agora by Magdalena Abakanowicz, one of the more important Polish sculptors. So maybe we can open it up to some questions and we can continue our conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dominic. That was brilliant, very interesting. One of the disadvantages of being online is that you can't hear the thunderous applause, but I'm sure everybody at home is applauding. So we're going to have time now for question and answer. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will get to as many questions as I can. So I will relay them to Dominic, and he will talk about them a little bit, and then we'll move on to another question. So the first question that we have is, what do you see as the future of the Polish churches which have closed?
Well, I mean, that's a really important question. I mean, it's unfortunately, it's not a very positive future. I imagine that many of them will be taken down or destroyed. St. Adalbert's, which is on 17th and Polina in the Pilsen community, was one of the largest Polish parishes in the city, and then became a very large and important, vital Mexican church. The Polish community and the Mexican community tried to save the parish. The archdiocese denied their request, and the church they're trying to sell the parish now. There was talk of turning it into a music school. There's been talk of making it a community center. One Polish church on the south side, St. John of God, actually, the church was turned into a basketball court, which many of us felt was almost a sacrilege, right? This huge, beautiful church had been basically destroyed. So when people ask me, how can we save St. Adalbert's? I say, well, you got to move back into the neighborhood and throw $1 in the bucket on Sunday. And they said, well, we can't do that. We live in Orland Park. I said, well, you're not going to save St. Adalbert's. There are many beautiful churches like that, not only Polish churches, but others across there were over 450 Catholic churches in the archdiocese at one point. I think we're down to about 200 now. My church, my parish I grew up in, Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish on 46th and Walcott, closed in 1990. So it's been gone for quite a long time. The other Polish church in the neighborhood, St. John of God, also closed. That's the one that became a basketball court for a while. Then they sold the building. They sold the front of it and was moved to another parish somewhere in the suburbs. But there's still one Polish church in that neighborhood, but it's basically Hispanic. They have Spanish masses and they have a Polish mass at 8:30 in the morning. So I think these old churches, they were built at a time when the immigration was strong and it was large, and people were dedicated to that parish. There's a Polish sociologist came to Chicago in the 1930s and asked these steel workers, why did you build St. Michael's, which by the way just closed, St. Michael's of Archangel Church on South Shore Drive. Why did you build this huge Gothic cathedral? And this Polish steel worker looked at him like, you're out of your mind. Don't you understand? I want to die under my own bells. I want to die under my own bells. That's how important the parish was. That's how important as a symbol, as a protector, as a, as a home, the parish was. How they can be saved. In Europe, the churches often belong to the government. The government pays for upkeep. St. Joseph Parish in back of the yard has a copper roof. And if you got $7 million, they could put a new copper roof on. But I don't see anybody lining up right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. The story about the bells is kind of the answer to a common criticism that you hear that, these are like these are exploiting the poor by, taking these dollars from these poor steel workers. But it was entirely voluntary from what I understand. And it was a source of great pride.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And people, their descendants are outraged when you take the stained glass windows out and you sell them, right? Mm-hmm. When you're knocking down the building, people are outraged because this was supposed to last forever.
Yeah.
But it doesn't.
Yeah. That's part of the problem, is that they built the churches so beautifully and now it hurts to tear them down. Right.
Well, in back of the yards, there were 14 Catholic churches in 2.5 square miles. That's better than Rome. And, you could make the 6 churches on Holy Thursday by literally walking 3 blocks around. You could just visit 6 churches. Yeah. But as these ethnic groups left that neighborhood, they were replaced by just one ethnic group, let's say Mexicans or by Blacks who generally are not Catholic. They fall into disuse. Mm-hmm. I mean, people come back for the first few years, right, for Mass and try to keep the parish up. But, it's a long drive in from Orland Park to the back of the yards. Mm. It snows and it rains, and you got a parish down the block, and that's the end of it.
Yeah. The next question that we have is someone is just asking, can you talk more about the split between Holy Trinity and St. Stanislaus Koska?
Yeah, it was quite a split. And in fact, at one point, the Archdiocese simply closes Holy Trinity down. They refused to allow Holy Trinity to have a Mass. Holy Trinity eventually goes to the Vatican, and they get permission. The Vatican representative, what's the Vatican representative in the United States called? I forget now.
The nuncio.
The nuncio comes to Chicago, settles it, opens it up, and gives it to the Holy Cross Fathers, because the Trinity parishioners still refused to accept the resurrectionists. They were so bitter. Today, that church is the mission to the Polish community. It is the most Polish parish probably in the city of Chicago, and it still maintains itself in a neighborhood that has changed ethnically, but as this Holy Trinity parish has become such a strong center for Polskość, for Polishness, that it maintains itself in the old neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. We've got 26 questions now, and some of them are comments, but many of them are questions. So I'm going to try to get to as many as I can and maybe group some together. There are a few easy questions like, do you actually speak Polish? I'm assuming that's a yes.
I speak, I'll tell people I speak po Chicagosku. I speak the Chicago dialect, which sometimes in Poland people don't understand. I do speak Polish, I read Polish, I don't, the Polish language is very difficult grammatically, so I'm bashful of talking in public in Polish, but when I went to visit my family in 1986, the first time, my cousins, they speak the Mountaineer dialect, which is, many Poles don't understand it. When I'd grown up with this dialect in the back of my head, but I had been taking Polish lessons for years, and proper Polish, and I couldn't understand them. But after 3 cognacs, it all kicked in.
Awesome. So there's another question about St. Stanislaus. Someone asking if you can talk about the struggle to keep St. Stanislaus Koska when the expressway was going through, because I understand the original plans were for it to go right through the church and knock it down.
There were various Polish politicians came to its aid and had literally had the expressway moved slightly over. A lot of people think it was Dan Rostenkowski, but it was really the local alderman, whose name right now I cannot remember, who actually got the city council to and the Department of whatever IDOT or whatever it was, planned the expressway to actually move it over a few inches. But you when you're coming in from O'Hare, you go right past the rectory window. I mean, literally, the priest could hand out communion as you drove by, right out the window. It's so close. It was saved. As by the way, St. Bridget's was saved for the Irish. This was the parish that the Dailies were married in on Archer Avenue. It was saved for the Stevenson Expressway, but then the Archdiocese knocked it down anyway, 20 or 30 years later.
Okay. Another question, why was there such a conflict between the Irish and German Catholic hierarchy and Polish Catholics in getting their own representation into the hierarchy? This, I take it as one of the causes of this, the schism, the creation of the Polish National Catholic Church.
Right. Yeah. Well, the Catholic Church in America was basically controlled by the Irish. Bishops, cardinals, etc., archbishops, and with some Germans also as well. The Germans had an earlier conflict. It's called Gehensleyism, and it almost led to a schism also in the United States, where Germans were actually asking for a German bishop who would only deal with German issues in the United States. And the Germans were the largest ethnic group, and still are probably nationally the largest ethnic group in the country. This was, by the way, a very Germanic city. The Poles were pushing to try to get more Polish priests. They also wanted a bishop so they could have confirmation, things like that, with a Polish minister. And there was a long struggle to try to get a Polish bishop, and it was finally Bishop Paul Rothy was made auxiliary bishop. And then he was sent off to Green Bay. And then another Polish bishop was brought in much later, Bishop Wachysław, and he was sent to Green Bay. So I have the feeling that Green Bay is the Siberia of Chicago. You sort of make a Polish bishop here, you send him off to Siberia. And there was a lot of conflict because there were pastors who were very powerful. There was the Polish Club, which was the organization of pastors, Polish pastors in Chicago, was very powerful politically, and tried to push. They fought with Cardinal Mundelein. Now Mundelein was German. You know, he came from Brooklyn. He was German. He would have nothing to do with a Polish bishop. He absolutely just would not have anything to do with a Polish bishop. He had Rodi Sandoff, and he just refused. And he actually probably destroyed some of the careers of some of the Polish pastors who were really fighting for this this Polish League that was trying to create another Polish bishop. So there was a lot of animosity. Over time, it worked out. The bishop I knew, who was Polish, I was closest to, was Bishop Abramowicz, who was a very kind and wonderful man. He was also an auxiliary bishop. There's never been a Polish archbishop or a Polish cardinal in Chicago. Though there Cardinal Kroll in Philadelphia was a Pole, and there were other Polish cardinals, but not in Chicago, which is kind of interesting since this is the capital of the Polish immigration and had the largest Polish population.
Right, yeah. Well, so talk a little bit about, we have a question here. How significant was Chicago's support for the Polish army in World War I? And was there a significant return of these veterans to the city after the war? Maybe I could pair that with another question, which is asking about someone who was saying that their family came around 1900 and then went back to Poland in the 1920s. Was there a significant return in the other direction, reverse migration? Yeah,
there was a good significant return in reverse migration. It wasn't a majority, it was a minority of Polonia, but there were many people who went back to once Poland was independent. You know, the Polish National Alliance in the 19th century felt that the immigration was temporary, that we were all going to go back as soon as Poland regained its independence. The Polish Roman Catholic Union felt that the migration was permanent and that it was important to maintain a sense of Polish Catholicism and not worry so much about Poland. So it was more America-centered in some ways. That changed over time. But the raising of Haller's army in Chicago was very, very important. And all the Polish fraternals, especially the Polish Women's Alliance, played a big part in this, getting young men to join the army. The head of the Polish Women's Alliance warned them. They said, you know, Polish women will remember if you don't join the Polish army. We will remember, and you will not have a bride. So there was this kind of sexual blackmail too. But about 25,000, not only from Chicago, but across the country, ended up in the Polish army. Many of them did return. The Polish American Veterans Association is still around. Most of those people are gone, of course, but their sons, their grandchildren probably are members. There are various other, after World War II, there was another Polish migration from the Displaced Persons, and they formed their own military organization, veterans organization also. So there's a lot of that goes on. They played an important, but Polonia played a real crucial role in fighting for Poland's independence, financially, raising an army. But also let me say that the great majority of Polish immigrants and Polish Americans in Chicago joined the American army during World War I and fought on the Western Front. I think something like 10% of the casualties were Polish Americans. It was a very high, this was a working class community. They joined in large numbers or were drafted and fought in World War I for just the year or so that America was really involved in World War I. But gave their lives on the line on the Western Front, also with the idea of liberating Poland because it was a defeat of Germany.
Here's a question. How strong do you see the preservation of Polish culture from generation to generation in Chicago? So I guess part of the question is, do the generations vary on the extent to which they want to assimilate and the extent to which they want to hold on to the culture?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. There's also a lot of intermarriage now, of course. and that leads to, sort of loss of those kinds of traditions. But, when I talk to my students, I would say, well, what do you do at Christmas? And I'll say, well, who looks for a pickle in a tree? Some German kid will raise his hand. I don't know why we do that, but we look for a pickle in a tree. Well, that's a German tradition. But the Poles will always talk about opłatki, about breaking the wafer. At Christmas Eve, we break the wafer, we share it with other members of the family, wishing them good wishes for the coming year and for Christmas. In Poland, this is all part of a larger Vigilia celebration, which some of us maintain, we try to maintain. My wife is Italian, and we try to maintain some Polish traditions and some Italian traditions. I've noticed lately that the Italian traditions are winning out a little bit more, but we try to do that. And my kids have all been to Poland, and they've been to Italy as well. Because I think it's very important for American kids to know where they come from and to experience that in their lives. Because I think some of us feel rootless after a while, even through the assimilation process. There's not the kind of concrete settling in of roots, right, into the culture. And the seeds get scattered, and some grow on fertile land. Some, I'm getting biblical here now. Some on dry land, right? And some in the road disappear. So, I think that it's important for kids to know where they come from, to know what their ethnic background is from, and learn a little bit about that culture. My youngest daughter spent 2 summers in Poland learning Polish. Her Polish isn't very good, but she tries. And my Polish isn't very good either. So we're about together on this. But I think that over the years, assimilation does take place, and especially when intermarriage, takes place, traditions are lost. But largely in Polish families, I see Polish American families. I still see the maintenance of the Easter meal, which is the świeconka, the blessing of the baskets. And I'll tell you a story about blessing of the baskets. So the archdiocese has now pushed this idea that this is a great thing. So even Irish parishes bless the baskets now, And I remember I belong to an Irish parish right now, basically an Irish parish in Beverly. And they're going to have the blessing of the baskets. So my wife prepared the basket in the traditional way. We had sausage and bread and butter, and we have to have horseradish because Christ suffered on the cross, and you have to have horseradish, so you suffer, that kind of stuff. And we took this to the church, and there were a bunch of people there who didn't actually understand what this was about. So they brought empty baskets to be blessed. And I said, my wife says, I'm not Polish, but I think you got to put stuff in the basket. So there's been this kind of cross cultural planting, I guess, over time. I think people do try to keep some of these going. Many Polish American homes still have pictures of Our Lady of Częstochowa, the Polish Madonna, in their house. Or on the Christmas Eve, we mark above the door the name of the 3 kings. Not on Christmas Eve, but I'm sorry, on 3 Kings Day. We mark above the door KMB. For the supposed names of the 3 kings and the date, and that's supposed to protect the house, during the year. So there are various Polish traditions that are still kept, but assimilation is assimilation. And when I was growing up, there were a lot of displaced person kids in my neighborhood, and they would talk to their parents in English. Their parents would talk to them in Polish. So when I came in and I would talk to their parents in Polish, they liked me, because I would talk Polish. Well, the other kids wanted to be American. They wanted to play baseball. Well, I played baseball, and I'm an American, but I also spoke Polish, and that was important for me. None of my cousins speak Polish. It's lost, and most of them have intermarried and other ethnic groups also as well.
Yeah.
So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. That's what historians always say. It's complicated.
It's complicated. It's the easiest thing for us to say. You know, as a professor, I've learned that many times the easiest answer is to say, I don't know.
So the questions just keep coming in here. We're going to get to as many as we possibly can. Are you willing to go until 8 o'clock?
Sure, not a problem.
Okay, awesome. If you were to describe the conditions that led to the earliest migration from Poland in the 19th century, was it mainly economic, and was Poland basically a feudal society?
Well, so there's two things going on here. Basically, I would say the migration was economic. Remember, Poland and the Ukraine were the breadbasket of Europe. They provided wheat and grain for the urban movement, the building of the great cities of Western Europe. Polish forests, provided wood for the British Navy, to build ships. Come to Chicago stockyards and the Chicago Grain Exchange, and suddenly you could buy grain cheaper in Chicago, even though you had to ship it to Paris, than you could get it from Poland. And Polish estates were in real economic trouble. And with that comes what we call uwłaszczenie. Uwłaszczenie means emancipation of the peasantry, because they were kept as serfs, basically. Now, there were Poles who tell you we never had serfs, we were always peasants. There were serfs. They were tied to the ground, the land. Uwłaszczenie takes place in the different partitions at different times. First in the German partition, then in the Austro-Hungarian partition, and finally in the Russian partition after the revolt of 1863. But the Polish economy is a mess because it was once a united economy that all flowed towards what the Germans called Danzig, we called Gdańsk, as the major port. It was part of the Hanseatic League, et cetera, in the Middle Ages. All that was broken up because these empires were also competing with each other. And so even the rail lines didn't match when you crossed the border. You had to get on a train that ran on different gauge railroads because the Germans were afraid the Russians would just get on a train and go right to Berlin. So the tracks were changed. And the Russians were worried they'd go right to Moscow. So the gauge of the tracks were changed. So the Polish economy was in a real mess, especially the part of Poland I'm from, which is the southern part of Poland, Galicia, which was under the Austro-Hungarian. So it's basically an economic migration. Now, was it a feudal society? Well, it's a feudal society that's going through transition. It's going to transition into a capitalist society. So this means even more upheaval, more economic upheaval, more cultural upheaval. People are being thrown into factories in places like Lublin and Warsaw and Lvov, okay? They're being driven off the land because the land can no longer support them. And so partially migration is an answer to this impoverishment of Polish countryside. So these peasants, when they come to the United States, many of them don't plan to stay. My grandfather was always going back. He was always going to go back. The idea was to get enough money here to go back and buy a little more land for his family, to expand the farm. And then I think this was true for many immigrant groups, Italians in particular. And so there was always this idea to go back and to expand the farm. But what happens over time is people get rooted here, they have children here, they have grandchildren here, they stay here. They have their own bells, they own the Polish parishes. Was it a feudal society? Yes, in some ways it was, because the magnates, of course, were the upper classes. Until after about 1863, the Polish nobility didn't even consider peasants to be Poles. They were just a sort of a sub-ethnic group that worked for them. The real Poles were the szlachta, they were the upper classes, the nobility. Even in the occupation, it didn't matter, they were still the szlachta, they were still the nobility, because the Tsar and those people would recognize their economic magnitude. So it was very much a divided country, which it took a long time to bring together. And America had a big part of that, because we were referred to as the Fort Partition, the fort part of Poland. Here, these peasants, Sienkiewicz, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, came to Chicago, and he went to St. Stanislaus Koska Parish, and he said at first he felt like he was in Poland. He said then he heard the kids talk. And they talked a terrible Polish. It was a mixture of English and Polish. They talked po Chicagosku, like I do. Okay. They talked this street dialect of Polish in Chicago. And he said they're lost to the Poland. They're lost. They'll never rally to Poland. But they did. Generation after generation, they gave money, they gave blood to resurrect Poland. And so in the book that I just wrote a couple of years ago, American Warsaw, I make the argument that Polish historians often ignore the immigration. And they shouldn't, because the immigration is a vital part of Polish history. And you can't understand Polish history without the immigration. In fact, you can't understand the immigration without Polish history. They both combine to each other. And I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I'm kind of getting around it, I think. Anyway, you know, I'm a professor, give me a break.
Well, a couple questions then about another kind of migration from the city to the suburbs. Someone is asking, why was it that the back of there, someone says they live in the back of the yards now. Why did it become a Mexican neighborhood after being a Polish neighborhood? Another question is, what do you believe were the main factors in the Polish migration to the suburbs? Could you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the Polish migration to the suburbs is pretty easy to understand. Back of the yards, the average apartment, I mean, I lived there, was 4 rooms, right? 4 rooms with a space heater. There wasn't central heat. Then some of the bigger apartments were 6 rooms, you know, 3 bedrooms, a living room, dining room, and a kitchen. Very small yards. My father made a little money. He wanted to move to Gage Park, which to me was the suburbs. And then he moved off to Marquette Park and then eventually to Oak Park. I've stayed in the city, but no longer in back of the yards. So I'm in back of the yards all the time. We built a little museum there called the Packing Town Museum, which is about the stockyards. It's in an old packing house on 46th Street. And so I'm down there all the time. And my cousins, some of my cousins still live in the neighborhood. But I think it's a matter of upward mobility. I mean, what does American society tell you? American society doesn't tell you to stay close to where your mother lives. It tells you as a success, you move to the suburbs, or you move to a bigger house, or you move to New York, or you move to San Francisco, or you move, right? And so as people become assimilated, it becomes easier to do that. And once that breaks the chain, well, then even newer immigrants want a backyard, right? They want better schools. They want fresher air, you know. I mean, I grew up with the smell of the stockyards constantly. Most people don't like that. I, for some reason, did, but most people don't. And so, it's sort of an upward and outward kind of movement. And especially after World War II, Polish Americans are leaving the working class. The second generation, the third generation are going to university. They're getting better jobs. They're meeting other people. You know, they're good, they're moving on. And the newer immigration is much more educated, often very professional, you know, professional jobs. Now, many of them get jobs first working out as cleaning ladies right downtown and working on construction jobs. But once they can get licenses for whatever profession they may have in Chicago, they get into that. And of course, they get picked up into this idea of upward mobility. And that, for most Americans, that means the suburbs, right? I mean, it's just the reality of the situation. I mean, I like cities. I've always lived in cities, but other people don't.
Thanks. So a couple of questions about, we've talked a little bit about parishes that are closing and so on. And there's a couple of questions about parishes that are thriving. Someone says, what is the secret for St. John Cantius? How is it managing to do so well? Another question, and yet St. John Brebeuf in Niles is prospering with multi-generational arrivals. Can you explain the difference?
Well, I think St. John Cantius has actually caught another niche for itself. You know, it's a very conservative parish. It has a Latin Mass, and Latin High Mass is, and I mean Tridentine. I don't mean the new Mass in Latin. I mean Tridentine Masses. And that attracts certain Catholics. And so that was very important. And they rented their school out, or they sold their school to I believe, a magnet school. So it's been able to thrive because it's one of the few places in Chicago that you can, if you miss the Latin Mass, if you miss the Tridentine Mass, it's one of the few places you can go. It's one of the few places you can go and hear real good Gregorian chant. Some Catholics, and some me, and some at some times in my life, like to hear that and appreciate the art of those masses, which were very beautiful in their own way, but had to change as the church changed. So I think St. John Cantius has found this particularly a conservative Catholic base that is willing to travel into the inner city, and is now in a neighborhood that's gentrifying very, very rapidly. And who knows? It may have a casino next to it on Halsted Street very soon, where the Tribune is printed. So maybe they can. Well, just think of the bingo games they can have.
So you can go to confession right after going to the casino.
That's right. After the casino, you can hop right in and go to confession. So now, meanwhile, the suburban churches, I think Niles is a big Polish population. I mean, that population moves up. I used to make the joke that when St. Stephens Koska lost 400 families to the Kennedy Expressway, they all moved to Niles, because that's where they were going anywhere, because that's where St. Adalbert Cemetery is. So eventually they're going to go to Niles anyway. So they just moved a little closer. But I think places like Niles and many other suburban locations on the southwest side, northwest side, and in northwestern Indiana have large Polish populations, which Polish traditions are maintained, and Polish parishes are prosperous.
So a question about Polskość. I was curious if you could talk about the development of Polskość as a Polish American experience versus what Polskość might mean to Poles in Poland.
Yeah,
So I just want to finish the question. Did or does Polishness mean the same thing in both spaces, or how might you see the concept of Polishness changing over time and space?
I think the concept of Polishness changes constantly. I think that that's one of the realities, and it depends on where you are and what time period you're talking about. Polskość was very important in Chicago in the 1890s, even into the 1920s. It changes over time. It changes over time in the diaspora. It changes over time in Poland. And what does it mean to be a Pole? Now that they're part of the European Union, now that they live in Italy and Spain and France and England, the largest immigrant group in Norway are the Poles. The largest immigrant group in Ireland are the Poles. Somebody had to teach you people how to live, little joke, don't keep your postcards. But anyway, what does it mean to be a Pole in Ireland? What does it mean to be a Pole in Chicago? What does it mean to be a Pole in Warsaw? And there's different sets of, social class also plays into this, and how urbane people are. So I think it depends on what period you're talking about, where you're talking about it. I think in Chicago, it's still an important part, especially among the newer immigrants. Among Polish Americans, it's sometimes a nostalgic kind of thing. Ethnicity in Chicago is food, music, and famous people. Those define most ethnic groups in this city. Food, music, and so pierogi, polka, and Puczynski. And that's the sort of average Polish American's identity. What does that have to do with real Polskość is another question. And let me I'll tell you a personal story. In 1980, I was in Toronto, Canada, at a conference. And in Chicago, I'm Polish. Everybody knows I'm Polish. I speak a little Polish. I teach about Polish immigration. I study Polish history. In Toronto, I'm with a bunch of Poles. I'm Poles from Poland, right? Who later became some of my closest friends. And we're doing what Poles often do. We're passing a bottle of vodka around and talking. And it got into singing. After a couple of bottles of vodka, you often break into song. And we were singing military songs. I knew a bunch of Polish military songs, and we were singing these songs. And there's this little poem. It says, "Who do you think you are? What are you?" And you say, "I'm a Pole because I speak Polish." And I recited this little poem. And this Polish academic came up to me and says, "Dominic," that's how you say my name in Polish. "Dominic," he says, "you're not Polish. Get over it." And I was shocked. It was like somebody slapped me in the face, because I'd always been Polish. I mean, I grew up under Pilsudski's lamp, just about, in my family. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, American Warsaw, was to work that through. What does it mean to be Polish? What does Polskość mean? Polskość is a basic theme in that book. What does it mean to be Polish? And I think it's very much an individual thing now, much more. And by the way, when I went to Poland and I taught for a year in Krakow, that same scholar, same academic came up to me, hugged me, kissed me on the cheek and said, "Welcome home." So, I mean, it was, also a bizarre kind of feeling. Though I've been to Poland 15 times or so. I hope to go again soon, once all this COVID business goes away. But yeah, it's Polskość is a transformative, or not transformative, a constantly changing concept, I think, even for individuals.
So I think we have time for one question left. So I'm going to try to cheat and maybe throw about 3 or 4 questions that people have asked and combine them into one. But some of the questions are just about the future of the Polish community here in Chicago, and more specifically, some questions about the future of the church here too. So what is the future of the present day Polish community here in Chicago? Does the church continue to play an important role in today's Polonia? Somebody asks about, is the Polish community here producing priests for the church? And maybe part of that question can be just what's going on in Poland, because the church in Poland seems to be going through a kind of crisis moment as well. So maybe just in the last 5 minutes here, you can talk a little bit about that constellation of questions.
Okay, well, I think the future of Polonia in Chicago is it's going to get smaller and smaller. Immigration is not coming in the numbers. Remigration back to Poland is increased over the years. There still is a trickle of Polish immigrants coming into the city. Basically, this is family being reunited or people being brought over, and sort of a word that has, unfortunately, I think, become anathema to many academics. Chain migration is part of that, bringing your relatives or your neighbors with you. But because Poland is now a normal European state, it is, even with the government that it has right now, it's still a more normal European state than it has been in generations, right, after communist rule. So, I mean, Poles can travel throughout Europe. They're not coming to Chicago as much. Okay, so the Polonia is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. The church still plays an important role in Polonia. I mean, you can still go to immigrant suburbs and immigrant neighborhoods and see this tremendous outpouring of devotion to the church. But no, we're not making priests. The American church is not making priests. And so Polonia is an American institution. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s, it was the church triumphant, right? It was never going away. I mean, there were so many priests, there were so many nuns. And then came Vatican II, and people said, wait a minute, there's an alternative to doing things. And, I went to De La Salle Institute on the South Side. And I think I had 4 years, 3 Christian brothers. I think there's 1 Christian brother still at that high school. There's been a secularization of Catholicism to an extent. And I think that's happened in Polonia too. People used to raise their children with the idea that this would be great for the family if you had a nun or a priest, right? I mean, I knew one family that had, I think, 3 nuns and 2 priests in their family. This was a real, honor. I don't think American Catholics feel that way, and I think it's part of the crisis that we face with the sexual misconduct. I think it's part of the crisis we face with secularization. And by the way, this is happening in Poland too. I mean, you can see it happening in Poland too. Poland's becoming more like France, not like Poland was. I mean, as far as the relationship with the church goes. Slowly, it's slow. I mean, this is, the church was always seen as this patriotic beacon and so an important institution. But it has, well, the sexual scandals in Poland have been terrible. They've been absolutely terrible. And the hiding of priests and, putting them in different parishes and moving them around has been a scandal. And I think the church will pay for that for a long time.
Well, that's kind of a sour note to end on, but that's it is what it is. I apologize to everybody whose questions I was not able to get to, but we're at 8 o'clock and we need to have some mercy on our guest speaker and let him go relax here. But before we do, just really want to say there's a few dziękuyes in the Q&A. Many thanks, and really appreciate that. It was a brilliant presentation and very, very engaging, very interesting.
Thank you.
So Karen is putting on, I want to thank as well as we thank Dominic, I want to thank Karen Kraft and Marlon Aguilar who worked and are making all of this run behind the scenes. They are the center of the Center for World Catholicism, so I want to thank them as well. Take a look at the book on your screen. You can see Dominic's latest book, American Warsaw, and we've arranged a little 30% off discount on that. So there's the checkout code, Pacyga 30, at the University of Chicago Press website. You can also scan the code down at the bottom, the QR code, to fill out a little survey about the event tonight. And I think that's also making its way into the chat as well, if I've got that right, Karen. We have, again, events coming up, also dealing with immigrant and migrant Catholicism in the United States, an event on Vietnamese American Catholics, Mexican American Catholics, Filipino American Catholics, and African American Catholics in the Great Migration. And then our World Catholicism online conference in May on young people and global Catholicism with speakers from around the world. We will be posting a video of the talk soon as well, so stay tuned for that. So finally, let's just all once again give our thanks and applause to our brilliant speaker, Dominic Pacyga.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.